Welcome, everyone. My name is Rich Reed, and I'm the director of the Southwest Harbor Public Library. And I want to make a pitch for next week. We'll have Maine mystery writer Matt Cost. He's coming to visit on Tuesday. And we also have our final tea on Thursday afternoon. So if you want to come for some socializing, be here. We're recording this event, and if you're online and you have any questions, please use the chat feature. And Kate will facilitate your questions at the end of the program. Anyone here, if you have a really time-sensitive question, you're welcome to share that with Ron, but otherwise do questions and answers at the end. And, this is a really good town to be a librarian in a lot of ways, because, we've got dedicated readers. People take their library services seriously, and they make good use of it. And one of the things that's really nice to be a librarian in a small town is to have some serious researchers. And that's been really nice having fun in our community who, keeps us honest, getting various academic texts. So that's that for such a small town. We have multiple researchers that keep us active. And really happy to have Ron here tonight. He's a Southwest Harbor resident whose work has included being a forensic social worker for the Maryland Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a case manager with the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, a senior United States probation officer, as well as forensics evaluator. Please welcome.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you all of you for coming tonight. My area of training and expertise as an undergraduate student was in psychology and in criminology, and fell in love with the field of criminology and finished up my degree at the University of Maryland in the year 3. It's quite a long time ago. And the field of criminology taught me a lot about doing research, factual research, and making sure that the data fit the facts. And so I've done a considerable amount of research working with primarily individuals who have been charged with or convicted of crimes. And so I became a forensic evaluator. And I ran 2 clinics. One was in the District of Columbia for sex offenders, and we had all of the contracts with the local agencies in the District of Columbia and in Maryland for working with convicted sex offenders, doing evaluations and doing treatment with them. And since I've been up here, I've also continued to do that work after I retired. I taught for 32 years at American University in Washington, D.C., and actually helped to start that criminal justice and criminology program. I was a professor at the university and continued to teach after I retired in 2002 until 2016, teaching my favorite classes without having the requirements to teach what the department wanted me to teach. So what are my fields? My fields are criminology, as both a researcher and also a forensic evaluator. And I continue to do that, hopefully, for at least another couple of months until my license expires. I doubt that I'll be relicensing, but the field of criminology just fascinated me. I grew up in the District of Columbia in an area of town that people didn't graduate from high school, and a lot of the folks that lived there, including people that I hung around with, got into trouble with the law. Fortunately, I escaped that happening, while my brother, on the other hand, ended up engaging in being a career criminal until he finally burnt out and didn't continue to engage in crime. And in fact, I visited him in prison, in federal prison, after he was convicted his last time. So the field of criminology is a very interesting field because it provides you with a good deal of understanding about the nature of crime and crime trends. And it also provides you with an opportunity to learn about the causes of crime, something that we call etiology, which is what are the causes of crime from a social and a psychological and ecological perspective. And the field also allows you to be able to study what's called the societal reaction to crime. And everyone knows the typical reaction to crime is punishment. And how do you punish? How do you punish criminal offenders? Typically, punishment involves incapacitation by locking them up and keeping them locked up. And the question is what effect does that have by just keeping offenders locked up? And what it does is it stops them from committing crimes in the community until they're released, and whether or not imprisonment makes them worse or makes them better is, I think, something that researchers have been struggling with for quite a long time. The field of rehabilitation, which is one of the objectives of the criminal justice system, is really a system that has been struggling for merit. Rehabilitation is not something that typically occurs in prison. Even with the best of programs, the prison environment is something that is filled with a lot of lessons about how to commit crime as opposed to how to be able to avoid getting back into criminality again. So the concern that I have about working in the field of criminology and working as a forensic evaluator is to understand what are some of the patterns of crime that we know about. Well, one of the things that we know about is what's called the dark figure of crime, meaning that no matter how much information you can gather about crime officially through police reporting and agencies that work with criminals, is you never really get an accurate picture of that crime because there's so much crime that goes unreported. And that's what we refer to as the dark figure of crime, meaning that there are reasons that people don't report. There are reasons why victims of rape don't report those crimes because of the reaction that victims often get, even though the field of care for rape victims has improved tremendously. It is a terrible stigma to have to go through the whole processing of victimization that occurs. So there are domestic violence acts that occur that the women who, or the men in some instances, just don't report those crimes, and so we don't have a really good, accurate picture about the full extent of victimization involving domestic violence. Another area is the elderly. Elder abuse is something that is a very, very serious crime. And the elder get abused not just in terms of their physical abuse that they experience by their caretakers, but elders also get abused by virtue of being taken advantage of financially. And none of that gets reported. Very, very rarely does an elder report the fact that they've been victimized. So these are some of the areas of what we call the dark figure of crime. We just don't know the full extent of crime involving the sexual abuse of children or the physical abuse of children until the children get brought into the hospital because there's a broken bone or some other event occurs that causes the suspicion in school that brings the child to the attention of the authority. So what are some of the other areas of data involving crime? We have a whole array of crime data that's collected that is official data. And the typical way in which crime gets reported is through the establishment of the original Uniform Crime Reports. The Uniform Crime Reports were first established in 1929. by the then chiefs of police, who came to the president and said, listen, we need a national database of crime so that we can really report how much crime is going on and what steps can be taken to plan to work on ways of being able to deal with the problems of crime. So the uniform crime reports have been going on, and they have been established data for very long time, and were reported and handled by the FBI. The FBI is the traditional agency that collects the uniform crime data for every jurisdiction in the country, whether it's a city, whether it's a county, whether it's a small town like Southwest Harbor. All that data gets reported to the FBI on an annual basis, and on a monthly basis. The statistics are reported, and they're kept so that there is a way of being able to account for the crime. Since 2019, the Uniform Crime Reports began to be considered for termination. And there was a new data collection system that was created by the federal government called the National Archives of Criminal Justice. Let me switch this over here so we can see it. I'm sorry I didn't do this, but so the original one was called the Uniform Crime Report, and now we have a new system that's been in effect called the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And that was implemented to improve the overall reporting of crime by looking more at the kinds of situations involving who is the criminal, who are the victims. So this data is a lot richer because it includes victimization data, which was not included in the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report just reported the total numbers of crimes per jurisdiction, and the National Incident-Based Reporting System was implemented to improve the overall quality of the data reporting. The other data collection system is called the National Victimization Survey. And the National Victimization Survey is another federal document that collects data on the degree and the extent of victims and how much crime that they have been exposed to and what the nature of their injuries are. And so we've got a pretty good data set that allows us to be able to understand what we call the field of victimology. And victimology is really the study of what happens to victims, how they became victimized. And that data is a national survey that gets done every single year. The data is collected on a small sample from around the country of victims who have reported crimes, so that we have some understanding about the whole field of victimology, and so that we can take some steps to provide more meaningful services, as well as to understand the patterns of victimization for purposes of trying to have the police be available to provide services to them. What about Maine? Where are we in terms of crime victimization? What are the patterns of crime in the state of Maine? It's interesting to note that Maine is actually in the second place. It's the second best state to live in terms of a low crime rate. And it's wonderful to be able to live in a place unlike the District of Columbia, where every time you walk down the street, you need to worry about whether you're going to get mugged or not. But the crime rate for Maine, the overall crime rate for violent crime in Maine is only 103.3 per 100,000 people, which is pretty amazing. It's quite low compared to some of the other states. And if you think about which states are the highest, you can consider that some of those states like New York, some of the states like Illinois, They have extremely high crime rates, and they're completely off the charts, whereas we don't have that particular issue. Well, I'd like to also talk a little bit about what some of the accomplishments have been in terms of crime control. What steps have been taken, particularly by the federal government taking the lead and the states following, to provide services and provide reporting systems that allow for not only the collection of criminal justice data, but in addition to provide just all sorts of grants for the states and locales to be able to use funding for improving their criminal justice systems, which is, I think, pretty interesting. The first of these was what was called the National Institute of Criminal Justice, which was established in 1968, and it created what was called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA, under the Department of Justice. And that was how I got my start in the field of criminology, because universities all of a sudden decided, let's grab some of this LEAA money and create criminal justice and criminology programs. And so in 1972, I was hired as an assistant professor at American University in Washington, D.C. to help create the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, which at that time there were 4 professors, one of which I was. And the department now has 32 faculty members, and they have all sorts of different areas of study that were not available when we first began. We were just not in a position to be able to know anything about the field of terrorism, for example, to know anything about the fields of victimology. We had to learn as we were going along about those fields. And so one of the things that we did while we were working to create the curriculum was we were training and educating police officers. These were police officers coming from Washington, D.C., from Maryland, and from Virginia to come to the university, and their education was being paid for by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was really quite an extraordinary thing, given the fact that police officers typically were not college-educated people. But that's what the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration did, was to create all sorts of funding for universities and colleges to create these programs at junior colleges and also at local colleges in the States. The next area that was created by the federal government in 1979 was called the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It was the agency in the Department of Justice that was tasked with the responsibility of creating and collecting all of the data on the various research studies that were being conducted and funded around the country, so that there was a repository of information that could be used by criminal justice agencies and other experts in the field of criminology and crime prevention to be able to develop programs to try to reduce crime. One of the things that we were doing back then was to also train officers in their response to dealing with domestic violence situations, because there was an incredible amount of situations where police officers would go to domestic violence situations and end up being injured because the partners would, if the police officer attempted to arrest the perpetrator, the other partner would attack the police officer. Typically, there weren't 2 police officers that were en route. There was only 1 police officer that was there, and he or she was injured very, very badly. So one of the things that was concerning was, how do you be able to deal with crisis intervention situations? Because that was a crisis situation. And so we took psychological and social psychological data, and we develop programs for what we're called crisis intervention training of police officers to help them to understand what kinds of things they could use to be able to avoid being injured. And guess what the first one was? Separate the parties. Make sure that if you go to a crisis intervention situation that's domestic, two officers have to go. One to take the victim out, and the second was to be able to take the perpetrator and put him or her aside, because it's not just the men that were doing the domestic violence, it was the women also. So that training ended up being a model for the training of officers all over the country. And this was funded through this program of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and then was created to be a national program. And that is the standard. It's the gold standard to be able to have all your officers who are on the street have at least 45 hours of training in domestic violence and crisis intervention work, which I think is quite a thing. The next improvement that the federal government created was to develop a national archive of criminal justice data, which was in 1978. And that program has really done a remarkable job of pulling together all of the various programs that I talked about: the Uniform Crime Reports, the National Incident Reporting System, the National Survey of Victimization. All that data is now in that repository, and it is available for researchers who are trying to study criminal justice or criminology at universities to be able to have access to that data and see if they can come up with some interesting ways of being able to improve criminal justice in the communities. In 1984, the National Institute of Justice was created, and that program was quite an interesting program that was primarily developed for the purpose of helping the communities to be able to seek what were called block grants for criminal justice programs of one kind or another to improve the functioning. Every state has a program that they get block grants from, and most of the governor's offices are responsible for letting the local communities and the cities know how they go about to be able to apply for those grants. I wanted to talk with you. I think I've already mentioned to you some of the programs that have been established that we've demonstrated have been effective at being able to improve criminal justice functioning. And I've mentioned the crisis intervention training programs. I'd like to talk to you about a couple of more programs that I think are also interesting. I was involved with the creation of what we call the drug court programs around the country. And drug courts are what we call diversion programs. And what we mean by that is if you've got a drug addict that's out committing crimes to pay for his or her habit, and they're interested in getting treatment. It's a hard thing to be able to get off of drugs, but if they have an opportunity to be able to avoid a criminal prosecution and a conviction and going to prison for a period of time by seeking treatment, that's the purpose of what the drug court programs are all about. So we had specialized judges that were trained in understanding addiction and the addiction model. We had all sorts of social workers and psychologists and caseworkers that were working with the judges specifically to be able to help individuals who were addicted to drugs to stay in treatment. And if they stayed in treatment successfully and they were clean for a period of 18 months, their charges were dropped, which was a wonderful thing. That only happens for a first-time offender. If a person started in the program and then relapsed by going back into drugs, the individual was then left out of the program and could not come back into the program until they could demonstrate that they were ready to be able to take the program seriously. If they didn't commit a new crime during that time frame, they could come back into the program. The whole goal was to avoid the cycle of addiction and then commission of crime and then going to prison, coming out without any kind of real assistance. And so the crisis intervention program that I mentioned for domestic violence offenders and the program involving drug courts was an amazing success around the country. I had the opportunity of being the lead for the Austin, Texas program for many years. And it was an incredible thing to see the staff and the judges working with the individuals in Austin who were struggling so hard with the addiction that was going on. What else can I say about crime control policies and practices? I know a little bit about working with sex offenders because those were the types of folks that I worked with when I ran the clinic in the District of Columbia for many years until I retired in 2016. So what are some of the programs that have really been effective around the country? The most successful one is what's called the SORN Act, the Sex Offender Registration Act, which is a national program. Every convicted sex offender in America has to register and check in with the local law enforcement agency in his community. And he also has to have supervision in the community by his probation or parole officer, depending upon whether or not he's had a sentence to remain in the community with a short period of jail time or prison, or whether or not he's been in prison for a substantial period of time. He can't come out unless he is under supervision in the community by a specialized team of probation officers who are working with him. And he is obligated to seek treatment in the community for his sex offense behavior. And in addition, he has to take routine polygraphs, usually 2 to 3 times a year. And he also has to be able to check in with the supervising agency every single month. And he can't move without letting his supervision officer know. He can't be around a school. He can't be around anywhere where children are. And he also has to complete successfully a program of treatment in the community. And if he fails that program, then he can be violated on the conditions of his probation or his parole. So sex offender registration is a very effective technique to keeping track of known sex offenders. Keep in mind that there's a lot of sex offenders that we don't know about. And the area that's the most difficult to be able to discern what's going on is the area involving child exploitation material. We're talking about child pornography. And those offenders are very successful at being able to avoid detection. So there's a good deal of effort on the part of agencies now to try to develop specialized units. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. What about the treatment process? The sex offender is required to be able to go through a period of assessment in terms of discerning his or her treatment needs, because we've had a couple of females that have been teachers mostly or working with recreational programs where they have become involved with students. They have to be able to go through an assessment and a treatment program, usually lasting at least 18 months to 2 years. And it's mandatory that they have to go through that. And sex offender assessment and treatment programs are specialized because they focus primarily on the causation of the behavior involving the commission of crime and getting at what was going on that led them to victimize somebody. Typically, what you have is a person who's vulnerable, what we call a vulnerable target. And the sex offender is very good at being able to exploit and take advantage of that person. So we work with the offender to be able to reduce his opportunities to be able to victimize. And we also track him. They have to wear tracking devices so we know where they are at all times. So what are the components? The first one is you look at the risk and treatment needs of the offender. They have routine polygraphs in treatment. You give them polygraphs to, first of all, assess the degree to which they are telling you the truth about the offending behavior that they've been charged with or convicted of. If they are telling you that they did this, but they didn't do that, but the charging documents say that they did a heck of a lot more than that, you need to get them to be able to pass a polygraph that shows that they're not telling a lie, that they're being truthful about the extent of the victimization, because you cannot leave a component of their criminality left alone without being able to look at exactly what kinds of pattern of victimization have they engaged in with the victim. Second, you want them to go through, in some instances, you have some offenders that are so committed to children. Everybody knows what a pedophile is, and there are some what we call committed pedophiles. They're what we call exclusionary. And exclusionary pedophiles mean they don't have any interest in adults. They only have interest in children, and they have a select area of children that they're interested in. It may be teenagers. It may be children that are young children, maybe children that are in the middle stages of development. But what you want to be able to do is to be able to make sure that you are reducing their arousal. And so there are medications and there's also techniques that are used to be able to reduce their arousal. This is something that has to be done on a regularly ongoing basis. And most of these individuals have to stay on medication to reduce their sex drive. Well, what else has occurred that's I think of significance? I think that for me, one of the most amazing accomplishments that the Department of Justice has developed, both at a federal level and throughout the states by virtue of these grants that I was talking about in training, is to develop specialized units that track the exploitation of children with regard to pornography, because children are absolutely victimized to an extent that we don't know about. And how do you capture these guys? Well, the way you capture them is you have all these organizations that are online that if Google detects or some other program detects that somebody has accessed pornography, that's not a problem because they do track it. But if they detect that there is child pornography involved, they notify that individual that they've been cut off, they can't use that program, and that that their IP address is going to be referred to the Department of Justice, and they end up being investigated and usually charged. And that's primarily through the child exploitation and obscenity section of the Department of Justice. And they have created around the country similar programs in every single state, and Maine is not an exception. We have a child exploitation section in Bangor. We have one in Portland, and they are very adept at being able to have officers who are trained in what we call high technology investigative units. They're online. They're acting as if they're children interested in hooking up with an offender who is actually trying to get with a child for exploitation or to trade pornography. And anytime that they're online, they're acting as if they are a child, or they're acting as if they're interested in trading pornography. And once they get a lead on that, then they begin to arrest those individuals and charge them with crimes. And those units are really doing an outstanding job. They also are involved in training. The grant money that's involved in setting these units up all over the country has expanded exponentially. So we have an area of law enforcement that is really doing a great job when it comes to the area of child pornography. And if you read in the papers, you'll see that people have been charged with child pornography all the time. Doesn't mean we get all of them, because unless you can actually get their IP address, there's not, you're not going to be able, and if these individuals switch or they drop or they're using somebody else's material. And let me give you an example for some. We've had a bunch of cases that our clinic has investigated where you don't know who in the family. It's a computer that's in the house and it's downloading child pornography, and it's listed it's the mom's computer. And there's 3 sons in the house, and there's a husband in the house, and Uncle Willie is living there too. You don't know who is actually involved in downloading the child pornography. So it takes some time from an investigative standpoint, but at least you have a lead on the fact that there is interest going on in engaging in that criminal conduct. So if you write to me an email, I'll give you my email address, or you can get it from eRich and the library. I will give you a list of all of the historical crime commission reports that the country has engaged in, starting with what's called the Wickersham Report, which was first developed in 1931 by President Hoover. We have so many crime commission reports with so many incredible studies that have been done on the causes of crime and areas of engaging in programs to prevent crime and to deal with the punishment of offenders. These studies have been going on for a very, very long time and continue to go on. The last one that was done, I believe, in 2022 by, I'm sorry, not 2018 by then, I believe, President Trump. So we've got an incredible history of crime commission reports. The one that's the most, in my mind, the best one is the one that was done in 1967. The report of the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the challenge. It's called The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society by President Lyndon Johnson. It's a huge, huge document. And it was considered in the field of criminology and criminal justice to be the most outstanding document that was ever developed in terms of being able to deal with the problem of crime control. And if you see here, you can witness the fact that there's just all sorts of documents that have been done ever since, the task force reports of one kind or another on the police, on corrections, on the prosecutor, on the defense system, on the rehabilitation system. Just incredible amount of documentation. The question is, do all these reports have any impact in terms of really reducing crime? The really good question that researchers have been asking, well, if we've got all these reports, what seems to be the problem? Well, what do you think is the problem? One of the problems is that even though these reports document ways of being able to reduce crime, you can't get implementation by the state governments or the federal government to be able to fund the amount of money that's necessary in order to be able to implement the programs that have been identified as significant ways of reducing criminality. So I'd like to end my presentation. I think I've got some time left. I'd like to end my presentation by asking you a couple of questions. And then I'm delighted to answer some questions that you may have about my presentation. I have some unresolved crime questions I'd like to have you think about. And I'm not trying to be provocative when I ask you these questions. So when I was a young man working in the federal criminal justice system, it was a crime to possess marijuana. I worked in the criminal justice system in my first job in the federal system, working in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia as a United States probation officer. We had cases involving white collar crime. We had cases involving mafiosa offenders. The thing that used to bother the heck out of me was the fact that we were prosecuting people for possession of marijuana. And the sentence was you could get probation, but I swear to you, I do not remember anybody ever getting probation for possession of marijuana, particularly if it was, more than a one or two joints. That's what we used to call them, joints. But if you had a large amount of marijuana in your possession, that was, even if it was for your use as opposed to sale, you'd go to federal prison for 2 years with no prior record of any kind. It was an automatic 2-year sentence. And I often wondered, what are we doing? Why are we locking people up for possessing marijuana when, everybody in the community that was using marijuana was finding it enjoyable. They weren't hurting anybody. They weren't. Now, if they were selling, that was a different issue. If you sold marijuana and it was a large quantity of marijuana, you went to prison for a long period of time. So when I was a young man working in the forensic mental health field as a forensic social worker at the Hospital for the Criminally Insane, we were lobotomizing patients. That was the standard practice in the hospital for overly aggressive, violent offenders who would routinely be lobotomized by the doctors. Well, I worked in that hospital for about 8 or 9 months before I had some problems being able to address the sort of issues of ethics involving just taking away a person's right, a right to be who they are. I mean, as violent as they were, it dawned on me in my arguments with the staff and the doctors was that this was good for society to be able to make sure that these individuals could be returned to society without being violent again. Well, that just didn't sit very, very well with me. So I would ask you a question, did you think that was a crime to lobotomize those violent offenders who were locked up for being criminally insane? They were not held criminally responsible for their behavior because they were insane when they committed their crimes. And they were violent. There was no question about that. And they needed to be tranquilized. But the question was, did we need to, do one flew over the cuckoo's nest on them? And that question has really remained with me for quite a long time. Well, when I was a young man and I was first teaching at the university, at American University, I taught a course called Institutions and Justice. And we were looking at what were some of the things that were going on in the community that were extremely controversial. One of the areas that we took up was the whole issue of the Ford Pinto case, and the amount of deaths that were involved in the rear-end collisions of those Ford Pinto cases. I know that my wife had a Pinto when I first met her, and it was a dangerous vehicle, and the amount of people that were killed in the fiery crashes from the gas tanks exploding in that car, amazing. The Ford company would not fix it. It was too expensive for them to recall that vehicle, and they just decided to pay whatever claim that they got from the attorneys that would sue them if they could actually make the case. And more often than not, it was a difficult case to be able to prove that it was a function of the defect. But the real question to me was the Ford Motor Company, were they engaged in any illegal behavior? by just handling it in that way? Were they guilty of killing people? Were they guilty of injuring people? I leave that with you to give some thought to. It was something that my students struggled with, and I think that they really had it began to open up their eyes to other areas of inquiry that were going on in the world. Well, I will tell you that one of the things I'm the most proud of besides my teaching is the fact that I was chosen as one of the evaluators for a case involving the Morton Thikol Company that built the rocket boosters for the Challenger case. And Morton Thikol knew that they had a problem with the rocket boosters, particularly what were called the O-rings. And we all know that the astronauts that were sent up on the Challenger were killed. But what you don't know, most of you probably don't know, Rich was just telling me there's a new book that's coming out, which would be fascinating, I think, to read. I was asked by one of the lead law firms in Washington to evaluate the lead engineer for the Morton Thikol Company. His name was Roger Boisjoly, and he was tasked with the responsibility of trying to fix the O-rings. Because what the Morton Thikol Company found was that if they flew any mission at temperature below 65 degrees, there was burn through on the primary O-ring. The secondary O-ring held. But they were very, very worried about the fact that there was burn through the seals of that O-ring. And they were working like crazy to fix this problem, but they were on time deadlines to get these missions launched like nobody's crazy. And they had warned the engineers warned the management at Morton Thikol that we got a problem with our hands, because the Morton Thikol Company was under contract to NASA to be able to continue to launch these missions. But they didn't tell NASA anything about the problem. Nothing. Never came up. And on the last mission, which was the Challenger mission, the site was shifted from California, where they typically flew these missions, to Cape Canaveral in Florida. And the temperature dropped down into the 30s. They had never flown a mission below 65 degrees. And they had burned through. Well, the temperature continued to drop and continued to drop into the 20s. And Roger Boisjoly and his team of engineers were telling the management, we can't launch. This is too dangerous. We believe that there's going to be a disaster here, and we need to be able to notify NASA that this is a serious problem. And so they did. They notified NASA, and NASA said, "Why are we hearing about this now? We're getting ready to launch tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you're telling us this at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the day before the launch?" Yep. And so they told Morton Thikol, NASA told Morton Thikol, "Are you sure you want to do this?" They were a contract. They were the primary contractor for these missions. And NASA reminded them that if there's a delay because of any noticeable defect in the system, that all the missions had to be stopped and the thing needed to go out for competitive bidding again. So they told Morton Thikol to get with their management and get with their, and come back to them online within 2 hours and let them know what their final decision is. And the Morton Thikol engineers and the management system got together, and the management system said, "What are you guys doing? Do you know that this is actually going to be dangerous? Are you absolutely certain that this was absolutely certain? This thing is not a good thing to do. This thing is going to blow up, and it's not right for us to be able to agree to go forward with this." Management overruled them. They got on the line and they told NASA, management has made the decision to agree to continue the launch. Temperature dropped down to 18 degrees. They launched, and the Morton Thikol engineers were in the room, in the satellite room where they could observe the launch, and they predicted within 12 seconds when it was going to blow up. So my question to you is, was this a crime? Nobody was ever punished. Nobody ever knew anything about it. Nobody knew anything about this except the investigation of what actually went on. They paid the families of all of the astronauts an unbelievable amount of money, and everything was just dropped. So my question is, we've got a bunch of examples here of behaviors that occurred, whether it's committing acts involving the sterilization of people who are mentally defective, whether it's, the criminally insane who are lobotomized, whether it's the Ford Pinto case, whether it's the Challenger disaster. And I've got a bunch of other cases that I had that are very, very similar. Are these crimes? They're not dealt with as if they're crime. But in my opinion, they represent the most reprehensible kinds of things that could possibly occur, because they're just, oh well, and left alone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about work.
I guess I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Very simple one. Going back to early on, we're number 2. Who's number 1? State is number 1.
I believe that New Hampshire might be number 1.
New Hampshire.
I believe so. What do you think is the worst?
Worst.
Louisiana.
No states.
Louisiana? No, I think actually Illinois is the worst state. But we have a relatively it's a safe place to live, with the exception of the terrible act of terrorism that we had with the mass shooting down in Lewiston. That's another whole area that I completely forgot about being able to include in my presentations. We don't have any data on whether or not those mass shootings are included in any of these kinds of reporting systems, because there's no coverage of those of the mass shootings.
Is that right? There's no task force?
There is, but in terms of the way the uniform crime reports were developed and the way this new system are developed, we have no data for really recording 9/11. I mean, those were thousands of people that were killed by an act of terrorism. We had the Oklahoma bombing situation, which occurred way back in the 90s. We had the uniform crime reports back then. It was never reported as the number of children that were killed.
So you reported on some areas of success. Has there been some success with crime, working with sort of mental health issues?
Well, you have to remember that my area of training and specialization was primarily working with sex offenders. The program that we had was a very specialized program, and I think we did a pretty good job. There were some areas that we had difficulties with, particularly with dealing with pedophiles. With pedophiles, you really couldn't get an accurate gauge on whether or not they were really committed to being able to change. But for a lot of the so we did a pretty good job. Yeah.
So Cheryl said, she's the line who said, yes, she thinks that those were crimes. Some of the things that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That they were crimes.
Yeah.
And then Ryan Weiner says hi.
Ryan Weiner.
Your son.
Ryan Weiner, my son, is
Yeah.
a deputy sheriff in Arapahoe County, and he's also an interesting young man who also happens to have a master's degree in social work, and he really works pretty hard on being able to engage in helping people that are, not just enforcing the law, but also being able to help people in need. I remember that he had a case a little over, was it a year and a half ago, honey, that he had that case where there was a woman who was being exploited by her significant other, and he was taking all the food, and he wasn't feeding the kids, and Ryan showed up, and he was able to handle that situation in a very, very wonderful way of assisting. He went out and got the food for the family, with his own money. And the lady was very, very, very taken with him, and the whole community rallied around the fact that he did that.
According to him, he says most dangerous states are currently New Mexico, Louisiana, and Colorado.
Okay.
What about the situation with regard to education now? Are you up to date on, are there undergraduate programs? Can a 18-year-old go to college and get a bachelor's degree in criminology, or?
I'll tell you what, I just met a student who graduated from our program at the Red Sky restaurant. What's her name? Megan. Yeah. Megan went to American University, was in the criminal justice program. She's back here in the state of Maine, working at the Red Sky. I don't know whether she's going into the field or not, whether or not but there are programs virtually in every single state, and even in Maine, we have a criminal justice program.
Undergraduate?
Yeah.
I know you probably get a Ph.D. in criminology.
Oh, absolutely. You can get, but keep in mind that those are not practitioners. Those are not practitioner programs. Those are researchers that are doing a lot of the work that we're talking about from these different kinds of specialized funded programs that are now available.
Got a question from.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I was wondering about like historic context, like how has the criminology changed over time depending on, like white supremacy and like, the chain gangs and all that stuff. Is there a trend in how we've been treating people as a society and in the criminal justice system that's showing a change? Or I don't know if I'm asking that very well.
You asked the question perfectly well, and I understand you. I do not believe that we have made significant gains with respect to dealing with the offender in a way that is designed to be able to help him or her to make meaningful changes. And in my humble opinion, I think that most rehabilitation programs, with the exception of the drug court programs that I mentioned and some of the sex offender treatment programs, I think that the recidivism rates are so high that we're really failing drastically at being able to provide assistance to offenders, most of whom really and truly need a helping. They need a help. They need a lot of help to be able to make it in the community. I hope I answered your question.
Are there like restorative justice? I know I've heard that the Maine State Prison is working on restorative justice programs are those programs under development? Because it's like the same time you hear this, and then they also have instances that are just absolutely horrendous up there. And so are those programs still a work in progress? Is there promise for those programs? I know there are other states that are interested in emulating that type of effort in their prisons.
I think until all of the model programs like restorative justice are good in concept. The question is how do you deal with the dual objectives on the one hand of trying to provide assistance to the offender through programs such as that, and then on the other hand with the prison environment itself and the violence that goes on in there and the degree of criminal acculturation that goes on in there. It seems to me to be an oxymoron. I don't see how, and I certainly from my experience in working with really very, very violent prisons that I worked in, I don't see how you're able to provide rehabilitative services in a prison environment. Even the sex offender programs that are in prison at the federal level, what they have done is to isolate those sex offenders into specialized federal prisons, which are not in the main population, so that you're only they're all sex offenders that are involved in mandatory treatment programs. Now, those programs seem to have some positive effect, but it's still too new to know whether or not those programs are going to have a long. So far, the results look pretty good, but you can't have a rehabilitation program and a prison environment that's essentially one that's designed to engage in violent encounters and one that's designed to obstruct the rules of the prison. I just don't see how that's possible from my experience.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Can you talk a little bit about the forensic assessment process when you're assessing a sex offender and their co-occurring disorders?
Oh, that's a very, very good one. In fact, if you have an offender who has some type of co-occurring, you've got to refer that person out because we can't do both. Even though the staff at the clinic was trained from a mental health standpoint of being able to provide treatment services and could effectively do a reasonably good diagnostic job, you still have to be able to refer that case out because you can't manage both. So you have to have specialized psychiatric experts. For example, if we had somebody that came in with an eating disorder, we had to refer that out right away.
How in your assessment process, how much of childhood trauma, childhood experiences that may have got them to that point of offending do you take into your assessment? Is that something completely separate?
No, that's another really great question. It is a primary causal factor. The degree of victimization that many offenders have, particularly ones who are engaging in more violent acts like rape or attempted rape or incest. They've been victimized themselves, so it's a cycle of violence, and we had a whole array of different kinds of programs that dealt with sort of that particular dimension of it, but it's a very, very primary factor is prior victimization.
Could you say a few words if you're knowledgeable on police education?
Sure.
Are there programs, for example, where you're a police officer and you can be given time off to go to college? Like,
Well,
there are corporations and places that would give you person time off. I mean, go to college to get a degree and still can be connected.
You asked a good question, and when the first programs were established in here under the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was how these programs evolved. We got the funding from the Department of Justice to create these law enforcement programs and to educate police officers to get an undergraduate degree. And they had to do, they had to do that on their own time. So we offered courses, we offered the courses during the day for those that are on the day shift. We offered the courses at night. They could come, so there was the programs needed to be coordinated so that they're not going to be able to miss anything. I don't believe that most police jurisdictions today allow officers to take off time to be able to from their job.
Yeah, that's what that's.
But it's the level of ongoing training that police officers have now compared to when I first started in the field. I first started, in 19 program criminal justice in 1972. And was doing training with police officers back then. The level of training of police officers today is really quite amazing to me. And they're still eligible to be able to get grants. And the chiefs that are really progressive are the ones that push the training. And the body camp, the cameras that they keep are things that have really helped a lot to reduce the incidence of the encounters with the public. Not sufficiently, but it certainly has been a huge success.
That training must not, certainly not uniform across the country. I mean, it must be up and down and varies lower.
Well, I think that the International Association of Chiefs of Police have developed curriculum that is fairly uniform. Yes.
Well, what is your opinion about, if for a college president who is dealing with, the anti-Palestinian movement and the protests that are going on the campuses? Do you think, at what point do you think you'd call in the police to create order? What's your opinion?
Well, I think you're asking me a question that's outside my area of expertise, but I certainly would just say that I think that anytime you have a campus that's in a situation of a riot, you have to have the police called in. Just because there's a sit-in of one kind in a building doesn't mean that you have to go in and violently remove those students of one kind or another. But that's a very specialized area, and it's not my area of expertise to be able to comment on it more than that.
Ron, regarding your other question about education.
Yeah.
Ryan, excuse me, agencies are far too understaffed for command to give time off for that, but some give tuition reimbursement.
Oh,
For you to go to school on your time.
plenty of time.
On your time. Yeah. Well, hello to my son. No, it's okay.
How do you think today, with we being universal, handle the Pinto and the Challenger situation? Those are years and years and years ago. You have an idea, can we feel confident that this wouldn't happen again?
Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens with the election.
With the election.
I mean, I think that, that the problem of white collar crime, what we call crime in the suites, not crime in the streets, which has been the traditional area of crime control. One of my colleagues which I think my colleague now is in his 16th printing. It's a book called The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison by Jeffrey Ryman. So I don't know whether the library has that book. Do we have that book? The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison by Jeffrey Ryman.
We will have.
It's the 16th printing of that book. And he really did an outstanding job of being able to lay out how the criminal justice system has just been completely ignoring any kind of, and has ways of, the criminal justice system is not operating independent of the political system. The political system dominates what they will do or what they won't do. And if a chief of police decides that he or she wants to go in a different direction, they don't last forever.
We don't have it, but we can get it.
The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison by Jeffrey Ryman. Make sure I tell him I made a picture.
All right, well, thank you so much. This has been great. We really appreciate it.